All right, let's talk about a business tool that can make or break your company's budget. The Training Needs Analysis, or TNA for short. It's really the secret sauce to making sure any training you do actually, works.
But first, let's start with a problem that probably sounds familiar. Companies will spend a fortune on training programs, but so often, nothing really changes. Performance doesn't get better, people don't learn new skills, and all that money just goes right down the drain. So, why does this happen over and over again?
Well, in this explainer, we're going to break it all down. We'll start with the problem itself, define what a training needs analysis actually is, walk through a classic three-level framework for doing one, talk about gathering the data, and then wrap up with why this whole process is so critical.
Okay, so let's get right into it. The single biggest reason most training fails is that it's basically just a shot in the dark.
You see, the fundamental issue is a complete mismatch. When you don't take the time to figure out the specific gap between the skills your employees have right now and the skills they actually need to hit your business goals, well, any training you do is just based on a hunch. And that kind of guesswork is incredibly wasteful. It costs companies a ton in lost time, wasted resources, and of course, cold, hard cash.
I love this quote because it just says it all, right? Throwing training at a problem without a real analysis is like organizational malpractice. I mean, you would never let a doctor give you a prescription without figuring out what's wrong first. So why on earth do we accept it in business? The training needs analysis, that's the diagnosis.
So, if untargeted training is the disease, then the training needs analysis is definitely the cure. But what is it exactly? At its core, a TNA is really just a systematic investigation. This isn't about guessing, it's about methodically finding those performance gaps. It's the process of figuring out what your people can do today versus what they should be able to do for the whole organization to really succeed. In fact, you can boil the entire thing down to these two super simple but really powerful questions. First, what needs to be done? What's the goal? And second, why isn't it being done right now? The answer to that second question, that's your training need. So how do you actually do this in a structured way? Well, the most common and established method is a really neat three-level framework. And this is not some new idea, by the way. Way back in 1961, two researchers, McGee and Thayer, developed what's called the Organization Task Person Model, or OTP. It's this three-tiered approach that's been the gold standard for TNA for decades, and it guides you from that 30,000-foot view right down to the individual person. So, the three levels are organizational, task, and individual analysis. You start really broad, looking at the entire company. Then you narrow your focus to specific jobs, and finally, you zoom all the way in on the actual people doing those jobs. Let's take a quick look at each one. Okay, first up is organizational analysis. This is the big picture. Here, you're making sure any training you're thinking about actually lines up with the company's big strategic goals. You're not looking at individuals yet, you're just asking, where in the business are we falling behind, and how is that hurting our overall objectives? So, for example, imagine an insurance company sees its customer service scores just plummeting. The organizational analysis digs into the data and pinpoints that almost all the negative feedback is coming from one specific place, the claims processing department. Boom, now they know where to start looking. So let's move to the next level down, task analysis. Now that we know the problem is in claims processing, we need to understand the job itself. This level is all about breaking down the specific tasks of that role to identify the exact knowledge, skills, and abilities, you'll often hear this called KSAs, that someone needs to do that job well. So continuing with our insurance company, the task analysis for a claims processor would define what an A-plus employee looks like. It would highlight critical skills like being able to analyze a claim accurately, having deep knowledge to interpret policy details, and making precise calculations. This tells us the what, the actual content that needs to be in the training. And finally, we get to the third and most specific level, individual analysis. We know the department, we know the skills they need, now we ask the big question, which specific employees in that department are falling short and in which specific skills? This is all about looking at how individual people are performing against those standards we just identified. Now, this is where things get really interesting. You can't just ask people what training they need. Why? Because of something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's a psychological principle that shows people with low ability in a certain area tend to seriously overestimate their own competence. They literally don't know what they don't know. And funnily enough, the opposite is also true. Top performers often underestimate their skills. That's why you have to do an objective individual assessment. It's completely non-negotiable. So our insurance company's individual analysis might find that, hey, employee A is a rock star with the calculations but really struggles to interpret complex policies. Meanwhile, employee B is the complete opposite. This lets them personalize the training, giving each person exactly what they need instead of some generic one-size-fits-all program that wastes everybody's time. So let's do a quick recap of this whole framework. Organizational analysis tells you where to focus. Task analysis tells you what skills to teach. And individual analysis pinpoints exactly who needs that teaching. Where, what, and who. See how each level just gets you closer and closer to the target? Okay, that framework is pretty clear, right? But how do you actually get the information you need at each of those levels? Well, that's where data collection comes in. There are a bunch of proven methods for this. Some of the most common tools are things like surveys and questionnaires, doing one-on-one interviews, running focus groups with small teams, good old-fashioned observation of people on the job, and of course, analyzing the performance and work reviews you probably already have. Now, a pro tip here, you almost never want to rely on just one method. Using a mix gives you the full picture. For example, surveys are fantastic for getting a lot of data from a lot of people fast. They're cheap and efficient. But they don't really tell you the why. That's where something like interviews comes in. That's how you get the rich, detailed story behind the numbers and really understand the root cause of a performance gap. So, we've covered the what, the why, and the how. Let's just bring it all home and talk one last time about why this process is so incredibly important. And really, this is the bottom line. When you do a proper TNA, you transform your training budget from what is often a hopeful, wasteful expense into a powerful, strategic investment. It guarantees that every single dollar is aimed at solving a real, diagnosed business problem. It directly links learning to performance and drives results you can actually see and measure. And that brings us to the final thought I want to leave you with. Without this kind of systematic diagnosis, what hidden performance gaps and unseen problems might be holding your organization back right now? Definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.